The 29th of April, 1943, over the Kuban bridgehead in southern Russia. 8 Bell P-39 Airacobras, American fighters the United States Army Air Forces had already largely written off as unsuited to the war it was fighting, dive on 3 squadrons of German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109s. When the fight ends, 12 German aircraft are going down. One of the P-39 pilots, a captain named Alexander Pokryshkin, claims 5 of those 12 kills in a single engagement. Within the year, Pokryshkin will be one of the most decorated fighter pilots the Soviet Union has ever produced, flying an airplane the country that built it had already decided was close to a failure. Pause on that. An aircraft type good enough to help produce the single highest-scoring pilot ever to fly American equipment in combat was, at almost exactly the same time, being quietly sidelined by the American and British Air Forces that had first ordered it. This is not a story about one spectacular dogfight over southern Russia. This is the story of the Bell P-39 Airacobra, an aircraft crippled by a single design decision made years before it ever reached the Eastern Front, and of the Soviet pilots who discovered that the very flaw that had doomed it in Western skies barely mattered at all in the war they were actually fighting. Part 1. Bell Aircraft's original design, first flown on the 6th of April 1938, was built around an unusually radical layout for a fighter of its era. The engine sat behind the pilot rather than in the nose, connected to the propeller by a long drive shaft running beneath the cockpit floor, freeing up the nose itself to carry a 37mm cannon firing directly through the propeller hub, backed by machine guns clustered tightly around it. The arrangement gave the prototype genuinely exceptional performance, reaching roughly 390 miles an hour at 20,000 feet, thanks to a turbosupercharger that kept the engine breathing efficiently at altitude, numbers that made the design look like a serious contender for one of the fastest fighters in the world at the time. The mid-engine layout also gave the airframe a distinctive set of side effects that would follow it through its entire service life. It required a car-style door on each side of the cockpit instead of a sliding canopy, an unusual feature pilots either loved or complained about, depending on how quickly they needed to get out in an emergency. The long drive shaft running under the pilot's seat meant that a hard belly landing carried genuine risk of the shaft driving upward into the cockpit floor, a hazard crews on every front learned to respect. And the weight distribution, engine, and much of the fuel load concentrated toward the rear gave the aircraft a center of gravity that made it prone to a vicious, difficult-to-recover flat spin if mishandled at low speed, a trait that earned it a rough reputation among instructor pilots even before frontline units ever got their hands on it. American training squadrons lost a number of student pilots to exactly this spin behavior before crews learned the specific recovery procedure and the specific speed and loading limits that kept the aircraft controllable. Lessons that eventually got written into pilot manuals, but that cost the type a further measure of goodwill within the Army Air Forces, long before it ever reached a front line. Part 2. That turbo-supercharger never made it into the production aircraft, and the reasons why still shape how historians describe the Airacobra's entire wartime reputation. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the body that would later become NASA, recommended stripping out both the turbo-supercharger and the engine-driven supercharger stage entirely, replacing them with a simpler, lighter, single-stage, single-speed supercharger, a change meant to cut weight and drag. That recommendation lined up conveniently with the Army Air Corps' own doctrinal thinking at the time, which increasingly viewed the aircraft not as a high-altitude interceptor, but as a fast, low-level Army cooperation fighter, a role that did not obviously require exceptional performance above 15,000 feet in the first place. Available turbo-superchargers, in any case, were being diverted toward Lockheed's P-38 program, leaving less incentive to fight for keeping one in the Airacobra. Bell's own engineers argued at the time that the turbo-supercharger's ducting and intercooler added drag and weight that hurt the aircraft's low-altitude speed and handling, the very qualities the Army's emerging doctrine valued most. So from the Army's own point of view in 1939 and 1940, the change looked less like a mistake than a reasonable trade-off for the mission the aircraft was actually expected to fly. The production P-39 that resulted lost power sharply above roughly 15,000 feet, precisely the altitude band where most European air combat, including the high-altitude bomber escort missions the United States would eventually need fighters for over Germany, actually took place. Part 3. Both the United States Army Air Forces and Britain's Royal Air Force reached broadly the same conclusion once they tried using the Airacobra in the kind of fighting each of them was actually doing. The RAF, which had ordered the type before America's own entry into the war, found it outclassed at the altitudes where Luftwaffe fighters typically operated over Western Europe, and relegated most of its Airacobras to training, or transferred them elsewhere rather than continuing to fly them in first-line combat. American units flying the P-39 in the Pacific and North Africa found it useful enough at lower altitudes for ground attack and close support, but distinctly unsuited to escorting heavy bombers like the B-17 on missions that routinely climbed well above the altitude where the aircraft's stripped-down supercharger still functioned effectively. An airplane built to compete with the fastest fighters in the world at 20,000 feet had been redesigned, almost by committee, into a machine that struggled to compete with anything at all once it climbed much past 15. American pilots who flew it early in the Pacific campaign, at Guadalcanal and New Guinea, generally rated it well below the Japanese Zero in a straight dogfight at the altitudes Japanese bombers typically approached from. And by 1943, the United States Army Air Forces was already shifting its fighter groups toward the P-38, P-47, and P-51, aircraft purpose-built or adapted for exactly the high-altitude escort work the Airacobra could no longer do. Production continued, mostly because existing contracts and factory lines were already committed, not because frontline demand for the type was growing. Part 4. What rescued the Airacobra's reputation was an ocean and most of a continent away from the theater that had rejected it. Under Lend-Lease, the United States eventually sent roughly 5,000 P-39s to the Soviet Union, close to half of the type's total production run, and far more than any other single recipient. Delivered via the Alaska-Siberia ferry route and through the Persian Gulf supply corridor into a Soviet Air Force fighting an almost entirely different kind of war than the one American and British planners had built the aircraft's rejection around. The Alaska-Siberia route alone, known to American and Soviet crews as ALS-IB, saw Soviet pilots fly the aircraft themselves from Fairbanks, Alaska, across the Bering Strait and the length of Siberia to the front, a journey of thousands of miles through brutal winter conditions that became, in its own right, one of the less remembered logistical achievements of the entire Lend-Lease program. By the time full-scale deliveries were underway, the P-39 had become the single most numerous American fighter type in Soviet service, outnumbering the P-40 Kitty Hawk, the British-supplied Hurricane, and every other imported fighter the Red Army Air Force flew. Part 5. That difference came down to a simple, almost obvious fact once you look at it directly. The Soviet Air Force's central mission throughout the war was supporting the Red Army's ground operations, not escorting heavy strategic bombers to altitude over an industrial heartland the way the United States 8th Air Force was doing over Germany. The overwhelming majority of air combat on the Eastern Front took place at low and medium altitude, directly over the battlefield, exactly the band in which the P-39's crippled high-altitude performance barely mattered, and its remaining strengths, a heavy, nose-mounted cannon ideal for head-on attacks, an engine placement that put a solid mass of machinery between the pilot and frontal enemy fire, and genuinely strong low-level maneuverability, came to the fore instead. Soviet pilots flying it at these altitudes found it could outturn and outfight German Bf-109s and Fw-190s under exactly the conditions Eastern Front combat actually offered. Soviet ground attack and fighter doctrine through most of the war treated air superiority as a means to an end, clearing skies directly over advancing or defending infantry and armor so ground attack aircraft like the Il-2 Sturmovik could do their work, rather than an end in itself pursued through deep strategic bombing campaigns. That doctrinal focus meant Soviet fighter regiments spent the overwhelming majority of their combat hours below 10,000 feet, a regime in which the P-39's stripped-down supercharger costed almost nothing. while its heavy cannon, effective in exactly the kind of close, low-altitude furballs that dominated Eastern Front air combat, became a genuine tactical advantage. Part 6. Nobody demonstrated that fit more thoroughly than the pilots of the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, which converted to Lend-Lease P-39s in January 1943 and went on to fight through the Battle of Kuban that spring and summer, one of the largest sustained air campaigns of the entire war. Between the regiment's conversion and the 20th of August 1943, its pilots flew some 1,625 sorties, fought in over 100 air combats, and claimed 167 aerial victories against the loss of 30 of their own aircraft. Pokryshkin himself was no newcomer to the cockpit by the time his regiment converted to the Airacobra. Born in Novosibirsk in 1913, he had trained first as a mechanic before qualifying as a pilot in the mid-1930s, and had already flown combat sorties in the disastrous opening weeks of the German invasion in 1941, an experience during which he grew openly critical of the rigid, by-the-book tactics Soviet fighter regiments were still using against a more experienced and more flexible Luftwaffe. That willingness to question standard doctrine, unusual and at times personally risky in the Red Army's command culture of the period, became the foundation for everything he did once his unit began flying the P-39. Captain Alexander Pokryshkin, the regiment's deputy commander, developed and taught tactics specifically built around the P-39's actual strengths, rather than the rigid, close-turning dogfighting doctrine most Soviet fighter units had defaulted to earlier in the war. An approach he distilled into a compact formula still taught in aviation circles today: height, speed, maneuver, fire. He introduced a stacked formation nicknamed the Kuban ladder, spreading fighters across staggered altitude bands so a strike force could concentrate quickly on a target from multiple directions, paired with patrols directed from the ground by radar and forward air controllers, replacing the older Soviet habit of orbiting defensively over a fixed point and waiting for the enemy to come to them. Pokryshkin also pushed his regiment toward maintaining radio discipline and constant air-to-air communication during combat, a practice that sounds unremarkable today, but was still inconsistently applied across much of the Soviet fighter force in 1943, where radios were sometimes removed from aircraft or simply left switched off out of habit or distrust. Combined with his staggered altitude formations, this let his pilots coordinate attacks in real time, rather than relying on prearranged plans that fell apart the moment a fight actually started, a small procedural change that made an outsized difference once applied consistently across an entire regiment. Part 7. Pokryshkin himself would finish the war, credited with 59 confirmed victories, the great majority of them scored in the P-39, making him, by most accounts, the highest-scoring pilot of any nationality ever to fly an American-built combat aircraft. He was named a Hero of the Soviet Union 3 separate times, in May and August of 1943, and again in August 1944, an honor awarded to only a small handful of Soviet servicemen across the entire war. By the war's end, only 2 other Soviet servicemen, Marshal Georgy Zhukov among them, and 1 other pilot, Ivan Kozhedub, had matched or exceeded that 3-time distinction, placing Pokryshkin in genuinely rare company, regardless of which aircraft he had flown to get there. Kozhedub, notably, racked up his own record-setting 62 victories, mostly in Soviet-built Lavochkin fighters rather than Lend-Lease equipment, a reminder that the P-39's story, however remarkable, was one path among several to the top of the Soviet ace list rather than the only one. He did not fly alone. His squadron mate Grigory Rychkalov scored all 56 of his own confirmed victories in the P-39, and other prominent Soviet aces, Alexander Klubov, Nikolai Gulayev, and the brothers Dmitry and Boris Glinka among them, built major portions of their own combat records flying the same aircraft the United States Army Air Forces had by that point in the war largely stopped requesting. Rychkalov in particular stands out even within that group, an ordinary conscript pilot before the war who became, by its end, the second highest scoring Allied ace of any nationality, a record built entirely on an airplane his own country's Air Force had already judged not worth the trouble of continuing to build for its own frontline squadrons in the numbers it once had. Part 8. It would be a mistake to read this story as proof that the Airacobra was secretly a great aircraft all along, misunderstood by everyone except the Soviets. The honest version is narrower and in some ways more interesting. The P-39 was a genuinely compromised design for the specific war the United States and Britain needed a fighter to fight: high-altitude escort and interception over Western Europe, and a genuinely well-suited one for the specific war the Soviet Union needed a fighter to fight: low-altitude, close-support combat directly over a moving ground front. Neither assessment describes some hidden objective truth about the airplane's overall quality. Both describe how completely an aircraft's reputation depends on the specific mission it is actually being asked to perform, a distinction easy to lose in a story built around one nation's rejection and another's celebrated aces. It is also worth being honest about the limits of the numbers themselves. Soviet victory claims during the war, like those of every Air Force fighting it, were tallied under confirmation procedures that leaned heavily on pilot and formation reports, and post-war researchers, cross-checking Soviet claims against surviving German loss records, have found the two sets of figures do not always line up cleanly, a discrepancy common to virtually every Air Force's wartime accounting, and not a flaw unique to Pokryshkin's regiment or to Soviet record-keeping generally. The figures in this account reflect the widely cited Soviet wartime totals. They are not the product of an independent aircraft-by-aircraft audit against German records, and viewers interested in that finer-grained debate can find no shortage of specialist literature arguing both directions. None of that uncertainty changes the underlying pattern this story is really about. Even taking a more conservative reading of the claim totals, the P-39 units on the Eastern Front were operating an aircraft the U.S. Army Air Forces had all but stopped fielding in first-line combat by 1944, and doing so with enough evident success that the Soviet Union kept flying Airacobras in front-line fighter regiments for the rest of the war, rather than phasing them out in favor of domestic types as soon as supply allowed. Alexander Pokryshkin's own post-war path was not an entirely smooth continuation of his wartime celebrity. His well-known wartime preference for American equipment over Soviet-built fighters left him viewed with some suspicion once the war ended, and Cold War politics reshaped how Soviet authorities wanted their most famous pilots remembered. He graduated from the Frunze Military Academy in 1948, held a series of senior commands through the late 1940s and 1950s, and only after Stalin's death in 1953 found himself fully restored to favor, eventually rising to Marshal of the Soviet Air Force and serving in national air defense leadership before retiring in 1981. Along the way, he wrote several memoirs about his wartime service, becoming one of the more publicly recognizable Soviet military figures of the post-war decades. His face and story taught to generations of Soviet schoolchildren, even as the specific detail of which country had built his airplane received comparatively little emphasis in the retelling. He died on the 13th of November 1985, at 72, remembered as one of the small handful of Allied pilots from any nation whose combat record was built almost entirely around a single foreign-built fighter that his own country's original customer had already judged not good enough to keep flying. A Kuban region street and a Novosibirsk airport now carry his name, and a Hero City obelisk in Novorossiysk lists his regiment among the units credited with breaking German air superiority over that stretch of coastline in 1943. A fairly ordinary form of post-war memorial that quietly outlived the political awkwardness of exactly which nation had manufactured the fighter he flew to earn it. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More machines whose reputation depended entirely on which war they ended up fighting, and more pilots who found in someone else's rejected equipment exactly the tool their own specific fight actually required. The engineers who stripped the turbosupercharger out of the Airacobra thought they were fixing a fighter for one kind of war. They were, without knowing it,
building one for an entirely different war being fought a continent away.